And when I started plotting out Ptolemy's latitudes, the latitudes are all wrong. Now, Ptolemy would not put into print data that was wrong, because it would mean that all of the people, all the surveyors, the seamen who who recorded this data had to have gotten it wrong. Now, it's very simple to use a cross staff to work out where the pole star is or where the sun is at noon, to work out your latitude on the planet. Now, if you take Ireland, for instance, the profile of Ireland is all wrong by about 6 degrees. Now, that is mind-boggling. Now, the only explanation for that is that the planet had to have been tilted.
Hello, my friends. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and don't forget to hit that like button and share the video with your friends. Please support the channel if you can. I appreciate all the support. You can become a Patreon for as little as $1 a month, or you can make a one-off donation via PayPal if you wish. All the links are in the description box below. Thank you. Hi, everybody. It's time again for Lost Civilizations. It's time again for Cataclysms and for Atlantis, and yet again for an original theory which might delight some people and perhaps annoy others. We will see. I would like to introduce to you Ronnie Gallagher. Welcome to the show, Ronnie.
It's nice to be here. Nice to speak to you. And maybe let you know what I've been doing, what I've been looking at over the last 20 or so years.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You are an independent researcher like many others that I have been interviewing on this podcast, this YouTube channel. And you have been lecturing at conferences, and you've published, I think, several scientific papers. I've read one of them. It was published in a journal that I can't remember the name of, but I understand that you've published several papers. Is that right?
I've published a few. Anybody wants to check on them, they can go into my academia.edu page, or I've got one or two in ResearchGate.
Okay. Yeah, we'll put the links in the description box so people can go and check it out for themselves afterwards. And before that, you were a teacher in biology and chemistry, and you've been an environment risk assessor and a risk manager. So how did you end up in the field of lost history?
Well, I've always been interested in archaeology. Coming from Scotland, there's lots of megalithic sites here. But going abroad, I really got into it in Azerbaijan, which to me at the time was kind of an unknown country. There's very little known about it, so I used to spend a lot of time weekends going out with a friend and exploring. We found lots of interesting things: cat rats, stone circles, standing stones, burial mounds, and a category of anthropomorphic carvings, massive carvings too, that still has to see the light of day in the archaeological world, but they are important to the overall story that I've put together. I mean, basically what I've been looking at is it really stems from the exploring Azerbaijan, where we found lots of interesting places, sites. But in addition to that, I became aware of strand lines and erosion features on mud volcanoes, which told me that the Caspian Sea had been much, much higher in the past. Now, scientists will only go as far as 50 meters above sea level, and that was during the deglaciation from the last glacial maximum, where the level supposedly, well, it did go up to about 50 meters. But in addition to that, the strand lines I was looking at initially was 220 meters. And that correlated with water erosion features on some mud volcanoes. So the bottom line is that having looked at this for quite some time, there was a great flood about I believe, 10,000 years ago. And in Azerbaijan, it reached a height of 310 meters above sea level. I've got photographs in my slides showing you triple strand lines, one at 220, one at 310. So I'm guessing that both of these were caused by the same flood, but under different circumstances. But that the water, and it was seawater that came in, maintained a level of at least 150 meters above sea level for some considerable time before draining away.
Okay, so we have this idea about a great cataclysm, a big flood, and you are in accordance with many other independent researchers, of course, about this, because many people are talking about a great catastrophe, a great cataclysm happening around what is often called, what is called the Younger Dryas period. Many think that was actually the time frame for this cataclysm. But you talk about a flood happening 10,000 years ago, which means that it's about 8,000 BCE, which is a little bit later than the Younger Dryas. So how is that? What's your time frame here? Are you connecting this with the Younger Dryas, or
no? It's in addition to the Younger Dryas. What the Younger Dryas is doing basically is the sea level, global sea level, or the eustatic sea level, was rising. You can look at maps, you can look at charts on that. But at 10,000 years ago, I've got an abundance of evidence to show that this happened very suddenly. Now, it's correlated with what's called the Flandrian transgression, in other words, the Holocene transgression, during which sea level rose even higher. If you want, I can talk about a number of the effects, but one of the main ones that is of interest is that the Mediterranean, all of the northern hemisphere, the level rose up, and you can see the consequences of that as there's chemical evidence, there's geophysical evidence, there's some. If you take, for instance, Israel suffered a mega tsunami at that time. That's in a scientific paper. What I'm talking about is corroborated by scientific papers. That's where I'm picking up a lot of my information. And you've got all of these arrows kind of pointing to this time frame when the sea level rose much higher. You also had it flooding into the Black Sea at that time. And there's biological evidence for that. The problem you've got there, though, is that the sea level in the Black Sea started to rise about 7,000 years ago. So there's a 2,000-year gap. And if you consider, I'll mention 3 other examples to do with the Mediterranean, maybe
Sure.
4. First of all, you've got a geologist, Mohammed El Bestawezi. He talked about the Arabian Peninsula and how the sea level rose to over 200 meters. If you take the Nile Valley, the River Nile backed up and flooded into the Fayyum, it's Lake Karun. Geological evidence shows you that first filled up with water some 10,000 years ago. Not 12,000 years ago when the Younger Dryas started. This was 10,000 years ago. In addition to that, there's a category of mounds on the Nile Delta, okay, and they're called turtlebacks. Now, the turtlebacks are elongated mounds, and the scientists can't really understand them, but they make perfect sense. They're created by Ethiopian sediments. So they've been carried down the Nile, and they've been deposited on the Nile Delta at a time when the sea level was much, much higher. Okay?
Yeah.
And it makes perfect sense. I've been in touch with one of the authors, but I've not really got any feedback from that. There's a very interesting example too, to do with the Mediterranean. and that's near Italy. In Italy, there's a lake there called Lake Braccione, and there's an archaeological site in it called, I think it's Marmosa. You need to excuse me, I keep forgetting names.
Never mind.
But I can get back to that.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting about that is that this lake has got very large canoes, or pirogues, as they're called. Now, these are seagoing pirogues, and they've been associated with the trade in volcanic glass. Now, the only problem is, for me, is that the site is some 32 kilometers inland and 160 meters in elevation. So it doesn't make any sense at all to have a seafaring community going across the Mediterranean, selling this glass or trading this volcanic glass if they're so far inland. That just doesn't make sense.
And have they been able to carbon date those pirogues?
Yeah, they go back to about 7,000 BC. So not 7,000 before the Common Era. The way I understand all of this is that there was a flood, started about 10,000 years ago, and it persisted for a number of years, maybe 2 millennia after that, possibly 3 millennia. And there's evidence for that too, in the context of, I know scientists will jump up and down and say that's crazy. It does sound rather crazy. But if you take the African humid period, I'm sure you're aware of that.
Yes, we've talked about that on the...
For about a 3,000-year period, the Sahara Desert was green. Now, this has been linked into Milankovitch cycles and the ice ages and so on, but those cycles are very, very long. You're talking maybe 10,000 years plus. But the African humid period came in about 10,000 years ago and disappeared at about 6,500 years ago. So it's a very short window of time when Africa was green. And that's got to be explained. Allied to that, you've also got, it's called the persistent Holocene outflow from the Black Sea. So you've got a lot of water coming out of the Black Sea at that time, and it's fresh water because it's got pollen. It's got all sorts of indicators to tell you that water was flowing out of the Black Sea at that time. This was identified in seabed sediments just north of Crete, just in the Aegean Sea. Now we know you've really got to cast a wide net to find evidence for an outflow. And one of the interesting ones that I came across is that the Atlantic lobster, or the Norway lobster, not the Norway lobster, the Homerus gammarus is Latin name. There's a population of them in the Aegean Sea and in the Adriatic. And genetic studies show that they are closely related to those from Scandinavia. So somehow the larvae have managed to travel all the way from the Arctic, all the way down through Europe, Eurasia, and into the Mediterranean, where they have taken root.
Yeah, and they're in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. They're not present in the western parts, maybe around Spain or so, because then they might have been traveling around the other way.
Well, you might think that, but again, there is a genetic divergence, if you like. If you look at the paper, I can maybe give you a link to it, or you may already have it. These animals, these creatures came from the north. And I think they're associated with the flow of water coming from the Arctic. Sounds bonkers, this. There's physical evidence that, when I say physical evidence, one of the features that I've come across is something called sand waves. Now, what are sand waves? Well, we all know what they are, because if you go to the beach, you'll see the ripples on the beach. And if you're familiar with the catastrophic glacial dam collapses in America, like the Missoula floods or the Altai floods, you get
Randall Carlson talks a lot about those.
Now, these are normal. I wouldn't say they're normal; they're dramatic at the time. But the sand waves created are, tens of feet high. Now, they are a feature of flowing water. So anytime you get water flowing, you'll get a sand wave. If you go to San Francisco, the seabed in San Francisco Bay is full of sand waves because of the resonance of the waves going in and out. You also have them in Ireland, coming at the western approaches to Ireland has got them. And if you go to Norway, you've got them in the Norwegian Sea and so on, where water flows. Now, the reason I'm saying all of that is that if you look at the Caspian Sea, I've maintained for many years that the sand waves, that they're called sand dunes. Some scientists think that they are sand dunes. In other words, they're aeolian. But I know that they have been analysed by Dr. Ekaterina Badiakova, and she can show that there's sedimentation in it. So these are not sand waves. They are caused by the flow of water. We differ in our opinion as to the cause of them, but for me, it's very much a case of water coming in to the Caspian Sea from the Arctic. And there's lots of evidence for that. There's biological evidence in the context of mysid shrimps. There's rock art. This is one that should interest a lot of people. There's rock art of whales at Gobistan. There's a 4-meter long whale, and it's something like 120 meters up in the hillside. Allied to that, you've got a guillemot, which I was asked my opinion on a while back by Dr. Farajova. And I said this because I used to live in Shetland, so I know the Arctic birds and so on. And it jumped out to me as a guillemot. She had it as a mystery creature because it had fins, a tail, and forelimbs. In addition to that, it's actually had the Brunich guillemot has got a white gape on it, and that is what this has got. So somehow these animals have come down over 1,000 miles to get into the Caspian Sea. I would add to that famous Victorian geologist, Professor Murchison, Roderick Murchison, he was asked to do, he did a geological survey of Russia. He produced a report, it's online, and in it there's a number of things that he quoted to indicate that the Caspian Sea had been inundated by seawater because of the species there, the salt there, the erratic boulders. There's a whole bunch of things that he talked about. He also talked about the Aral Sea. In terms of elevation, the Aral Sea is about, I think it's about 80 meters above sea level. And there was evidence there too. And there's also evidence from another quarter. Dr. Ian Boomer has done a sedimentological study there, and he could show that there's been 3 main events. One of the events, he called it Event 2, that's at 10,000 years. So again, that is when water came into the Arctic, into the Aral Sea. So you've got evidence like that. And
I just have to ask you, sorry to interrupt, but you are talking about this big flood that you have found evidence happened, and there are all kinds of signs and indications that you're talking about here, and you have focused your research on the area around the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, and southern Russia and Caucasus and that area. But the time frame differs from the period that most people are talking about, like as we mentioned here. So let's talk before we get back to the consequences of this flood and what it has meant for civilizations and things like that. What do you think the causes are, the possible causes behind this cataclysm? Because most people talk about the Younger Dryas period, which is about a couple of thousand years earlier than you were talking about, and there are those who are proponents of the, Robert Schoch's theory about an active sun, extreme sun, coronal mass ejections, and outbursts from the sun that have created all kinds of disruptions on Earth and melted the ice cap very much quicker than would otherwise have happened after the Ice Age. And there are others who are talking about, of course, an astronomical impact from an asteroid or several comets that have bombarded the Earth for perhaps hundreds of years and created all kinds of disruptions and disturbances, and for instance this big flood. But you were talking about a period a couple of thousand years after that, or maybe 3,000 years after that. So what, did nothing happen during the Younger Dryas? You know that there was a dramatic climatic change during that period?
But I know there was. Was. And I think the evidence does tend to favor some kind of a celestial event. I think Robert Schoch is on the right track, and that is what I've come to understand. I think, did you read the last paper? I did.
Yeah, I think it was the last one that I read. Yeah. And you have some interesting ideas about it.
What I think has happened, static sea level is one thing. Let's put that to the side at the moment. Around 10,000 or 9,700 years ago, you had this upset, this extraordinary event. And the only thing that makes sense, in fact, if you look at all of the evidence I've got, the only thing that makes sense is that the planet had actually tilted. If I can use this little model here, I'm sure you've all seen this kind of thing.
Yes, I have a globe behind me as well.
Yeah. Right. If the planet tilts this way, then the stars, the heavens drop down in the sky. That's quite important because there's records for that. There's also records from China and from Babylon. They talk about shadow sticks. Now, or solstice sticks. So if you take the solstice and check the shadow stick, the records for the shadow sticks, then they say that they are different. You cannot use water clocks. You cannot use shadow sticks from those times to comply with today's situation. Now, by that I mean that, if you take the Babylonians basically said that Babylon was something like 2 degrees to the north at the time of their recording. If you take
as compared to where it is now
today, yeah. One of the things I looked at before I found out the Babylonian thing was Ptolemy. I was interested in Gaius Claudius Ptolemy, who was a monk in the middle of the 1st century. He worked at the Library of Alexandria, so he would have had access to scrolls going back hundreds, maybe thousands of years. And he compiled a geographia over something like 8,000 locations around the known world at the time. And I started to look at it because I saw a map of Scotland, of Britain, and Scotland is way off to the side. It doesn't look like the United Kingdom at all. And when I started plotting out Ptolemy's latitudes, the latitude, forget the longitudes because they're just slightly more
much
complex.
More difficult to determine longitude than latitude,
Yeah, but the latitudes are all wrong. Now, Ptolemy would not put into print data that was wrong, because it would mean that all of the people, all the surveyors, the seamen who recorded this data had to have gotten it wrong. Now, it's very simple to use a cross staff to work out where the pole star is or where the sun is at noon, to work out your latitude on the planet. Now, if you take Ireland, for instance, the promontories in Ireland, the profile of Ireland, is all wrong by about 6 degrees. Now, that is mind-boggling. There's a whole range of latitudes coming up to Roman times when Ptolemy was alive, and they get closer to the norm, but they're still about 1 degree out. Now, the only explanation for that is that the planet had to have been tilted up this way a wee bit, so that when you're looking at the North Star or the sun at solstice, you're going to get a higher relative latitude, and only over the period of recording has that come down again. I've been in touch with a lot of people. They can't really basically understand it. But you've also got, Ptolemy wrote 3 books. He wrote the Amalgest, he wrote the Geographia. The Amalgest is to do with the heavens, the stars. And I've not yet gone fully into it, but I'm getting similar orientations, similar latitudes. They call them ascensions when you're looking at the heavens, latitudes on the land. So I can show that the land has actually come down. Now, astronomers, they've been looking at the planet for hundreds of years, and they say that the Earth is totally stable. It hasn't moved. There is a bit of a wobble called the Chandler wobble, but by and large, the planet, the Earth hasn't moved. But the evidence shows,
apart from the Milankovitch cycles, of course, that you mentioned, three types of wobbles, so to speak. But those are very long.
They're very long. They're to do with the shape of the orbit. Okay, so the evidence shows that the planet has actually tilted. Now, what I've got from the water coming out of the Black Sea area, if you look at the diagram, you can see that it persisted for about 2,500 to 3,000 years. Now, the only way that makes sense, if you bear with me for a moment, if you take the planet's obviously rotating, so you've got centrifugal forces, and you've got the 2 bulges on each side of the planet. So the Earth rotates through that, and that gives us 2 tides per day. Now, if the planet was to suddenly tilt up the way, the rotation is still north to south, but this time the water has moved north, closer. Got the Earth upside down, closer to the. Let's say it goes up 20 degrees, and there's evidence that may be the case. Well, the Earth, you've now got 2 vectors involved here. You've got the centrifugal force throwing the water out to give you the relative sea level, but you've also got the sun and the moon, and they're going to be lifting the water too. So you've got a combination of water level to do with the centrifugal force and to do with gravity. So somewhere in between, you're going to have a vector, and that will determine where the sea level was. And that is the feature that I think has happened. What I've tried to do in my paper is to offer a straw man, basically, as to what might have caused this. And this takes us into the territory of Robert Schoch. He thinks it's to do with a coronal mass ejection, and I'm inclined to agree with him on that. But in particular, I'm looking at a solar proton event. Now, space weather is very important. You probably know we're getting lots of aurora borealis at the moment, and that's because we're coming into a solar maximum. Every 11 years you get a solar maximum. But that's not necessarily the cause of the CME, because the CMEs, if you look back through the records, The biggest one in human history was the Carrington event.
1859.
And 1859, that's right. And that occurred, I think it's Richard Carrington, looking at sunspots, got the big flash. 17 hours later, the aurora came, and telegraph operators were getting electric shocks and so on. So there's a massive impact on the Earth's magnetosphere at the time, and feeding back in to give you induction, electrical currents in wires and so on. That's why space weather is so important, because it can affect electronics and so on. Now, excuse me, these, if you go back even further, you've got things called the Miyake events, and that's about 14,000 years ago, slightly before the Younger Dryas. Now, I can't say that the Younger Dryas gave rise to a sudden influx of water, but what I can say is that 10,000 years ago, as I say, there's an abundance of evidence to show that there probably was a tilt, there was a sudden flood, and then over a period of time, with the sun and the moon tugging on the planet's bulge, brought it back down to where it is today at about 23.5 degrees.
So there was a bulge in the ocean water globally, which moved northward or inundated certain areas, and maybe left other areas with lower water levels, perhaps?
No, it happened all over the world. Because what I've done, one of the things I did that got me into sand waves was to assume, we know that the Caspian Sea, the strand lines there were, I used something like 150 meters, because I know that the water persisted at that time based on the evidence on the mud volcano. So I said, well, let's ask a what if question. If the water level was high in the northern hemisphere, it's also going to be high in the southern hemisphere. And I started looking at places like Australia. Australia has got a range of deserts. The Simpson Desert is the most obvious one. That's about 100 meters above sea level. The Aborigines have got stories of massive floods. When you look at the Simpson Desert, you will see this perfectly straight sand dunes. Now, you don't get perfectly straight sand dunes. They're always higgledy-piggledy, depending on the way the wind's blowing, and sometimes you've got one or two different directions, predominant directions. So you don't get straight strand lines. Now, one of the papers I read showed that, well, all of these sand dunes are static. They're not doing anything. So there's nothing happening in the world today to create these sand dunes. Now, they're not, I don't believe they're sand dunes. I believe that they are sand waves
from the bottom of the sea when it was much higher.
All of the material that makes up these sand waves are from local. They haven't blown in from anywhere. They are local. Now, if you start looking all around the world, you find sand waves all over the place. I mentioned the Volga. In Russia, you've got other lake. One of the best places in Russia, if you go to the river Lena, which goes into near the Bering Strait, you will find sand waves there. Now, they're not called sand waves; they're called elongated lakes. Now, you find them in Canada, you find them in Alaska, you find them in Argentina, you find them in Bolivia, and so on. These elongated lakes are actually the troughs of the sand waves. If you stand back, if you look at it on Google Earth, you can actually see it's quite clear. Whereas scientists have been looking at the lakes, what they should have been doing is looking at the ridges that created the lakes. So what you've got there is a series of sand waves that were created at a time when the relative sea level was much, much higher.
Interesting. Let me just back up a little bit, because I think many of the listeners can't quite understand how coronal mass ejection, however big it is, could actually cause the planet to tilt. But as far as I understand, we have to take into account the magnetics. There is a magnetic field around the Earth, but there's also a magnetic core. The Earth has a core which has been, as far as I understand your theory, affected by this extreme event, the outburst from the sun, and this is what has caused the kind of the wobble of the Earth. Isn't that right? Because otherwise, it's very difficult to understand how this could actually tilt the Earth.
What you've got in the center of the Earth is you've got a core, a solid core, and a liquid outer core, and that gives you a geodynamo. And it's the rotation of this that creates the magnetic field that we've got. And the inner and the outer core weigh something like a third of the mass of the Earth. So you've got a third of the mass is magnetic. And what you've got coming from a coronal mass ejection, you've got billions and billions of tons. Now, I'm not a geophysicist, so I can't really look into this. I can only have a simplistic view on what might have happened. If you have it's also known as a solar proton event. Carrington saw the light. That's the electrons. That's the light that initiated it came before the heavy ionic particles, the billions of tons. So if you've got the Earth's magnetic field like this, think of the Earth as a big bar magnet. And you think of it as a bar magnet, and you've got all these protons coming in. What's going to happen is that the protons are positive. Now, the top of the Earth is positive too, so you're going to get a repulsion effect. The bottom of the Earth, the South Pole, is negative, so that's going to be attracted to the solar coronal mass ejection. So it will depend on the force. I can't work out. I don't know enough about physics to work out Maxwell's equations and so on to see if this can actually be modeled. I think it probably could be modeled. But if I show you a very simple demonstration of what it might look like as an experiment. I used to be a school teacher, so here is the planet Earth.
Mm-hmm.
The gyroscope represents the planet Earth. Now, inside the gyroscope, I've got two magnets, and this represents the bar magnet of the Earth. And I've also put a little weight at the bottom so that it sits more or less vertically. So that's the effect of gravity. If it was perfectly balanced, it would sit anywhere. Now, what I've also got is a little device here. I get two magnets, and if you bring the magnets close to can you see it moving?
Yeah.
So that's it being attracted to the top and repulsed in the bottom. If I turn this around, it will go the other way. It's attracted there and repulsed up there. So if this is a solar proton event, this would be the arrangement. The North Pole would get pushed away and the South Pole would be attracted. If I reverse the polarity, the opposite happens. Yeah. So it's something along those lines that I think is happening to the planet. But I've been in touch with geophysicists and they basically say, no, this is impossible. Mm. But I don't like that word impossible.
Yeah, but I have a follow-up question to that, because I mean that was very clear demonstration, and it makes sense and all of that. But you were talking about Ptolemy's wrong latitudes, 5 or 6 degrees off as compared to where places are located today, and he wouldn't reasonably be that much wrong, because it's, as we said, not so difficult to calculate the latitude of a place. Even the ancient Greeks knew that, of course. But I'm thinking, if the North Pole, the geographical North Pole and the geographical South Pole are at the same place, regardless of how much the Earth tilts. And that means that the equator is also at the same location. The Earth is still rotating around the equator as it used to be. Nothing has happened apart from the fact that the planet has tilted. Then the latitude wouldn't change, because the latitude you calculate from the equator, which is 0, and the North Pole is 90. So what would happen if it's merely a tilt, in my view, is that, I mean, the seasons would be much more extreme. Summer and winter would be much more different from each other in the northern latitudes and the southern latitudes. But nothing would happen with the latitudes. So what I'm thinking is that, and this ties in with at least a little bit with what Mario Bildreps talks about. He has this very fascinating theory about an expanding Earth, but we don't have to dive into that. But I'm thinking of a crust displacement. If the crust is being displaced as an effect of this extreme event, this extreme solar cosmic event, then it would make sense that the latitudes change, because then the Earth's surface of the Earth has kind of tipped over, or it has moved. It has been displaced. So the North Pole is at another location than it used to be before, and then it goes back. What are your thoughts on that? My amateur analysis here.
Now, there's a few points there that are of interest. If the Earth tilts, now you're right, the Earth continues to rotate. So from the viewpoint of an observer on the Earth, the planet would still be rotating. But if you looked up to the sky, you would see that the sun was actually falling. In this case here, where the planet tilts this way, then anyone looking at the sun sees it.
Yeah, tilt the camera a little bit down so we can see the Earth there nicely.
What this means is that the stars are high. Stars become lower in the sky when it goes this way, and the North Pole shifts too. And vice versa. Now, there's a bunch of things here. The Egyptians have actually recorded this. If you take, so the planet's rotating the same way, but if you go to the stories of the planet actually flipping, so turning upside down. And when it turns upside down, the stars will actually go the wrong way. The sun will rise in the west and set in the east. Now, if you go to Egypt and look at Senmut was, I think it was an architect for Queen Hatshepsut. On the ceiling of his tomb, you've got two sets of star pictures, one the right way and one the wrong way. Now, archaeologists have given an explanation for this to do with the wandering through the underworld at night. But basically, that kind of thing could potentially happen. Now, I need to bring in another idea here. It's called the Jani-Bekoff effect. Have you heard of Jani-Bekoff?
No, I don't think so, no.
Right, okay. Jani-Bekoff basically was a cosmonaut, and he was up in space, and he was taking a T-bar screw. So if you turn a T-bar rapidly, it will rotate, it will come off its bolt, basically. And when it does that, it flips back and forward. Now, this is actually it's not well known, it's a known phenomenon. If you can try this with your telephone or a tennis racket, if you've got that. There are, in a tennis racket, there are what they call 3 moments of inertia. So if you take a tennis racket, let's say this phone's a tennis racket, you can rotate it in that direction. That's one direction. Or you can take it in this direction. Or you can take it in this direction. That's the lowest energy. Now, I'm saying that you can go online, and if you look at the tennis racket theorem, it will give you links to the Jani-Bekoff effect. And in that, you've actually got a globe. This was done in space by Jani-Bekoff. If you take a globe, you had a bolt in it, and he rotated it. And what happened was that it would flip back and forward. So there is a physical phenomenon there that I think it could apply to the Earth. And it may well be that the force that you're going to get from a solar proton event could be enough to induce an imbalance in the center of the Earth, so that in the Earth there are two moments of inertia. If you've got I believe I'm right in saying that, you've got the North Pole, the axis of the planet, and you've also got the magnetic North Pole. So they are slightly askew.
Yeah.
And it might well be that by influencing the minor axis, the minor moment of inertia, that's the magnetic North and South Pole, that could cause the imbalance, to cause the planet to flip. But it's flipping into a position of instability and will flip back again, just as you see on the Johnny Bekoff experiments. So I think that's roughly what's been happening there. If the planet was offset up to here and slowly get brought back due to the effect of gravity, that would be on a curve. So in effect, over the last, say, few thousand years, the curve would be shallowing out. And that brings us down to 23.5 degrees. You're talking about the obliquity of the ecliptic. That's the phrase they actually use. So that's why I think since Ptolemy's time, so let's say 1900 years, you've probably come down to a steady state, in which case you won't see this. Astronomers would never see this, but I believe you've got to trust the records of the past, the Chinese, the Assyrians, the Mayans. There's so many people have talked about falling skies. If you take the Greek myth of Phaeton, they talk about the sun falling. They talk about the star or the sun falling down.
Okay, so that was a long and very interesting and fascinating explanation of the causes behind the big cataclysm there that happened, and the big flood. And let's just assume that you're right in your assumptions there. But at any rate, it happened. There was a big flood, and so many others are also talking about evidence. There's so much evidence that there was a big flood, and can be discussion as to when it happened. But you're talking about 10,000 years ago or so. And so let's then go. I don't know how much we can dive into the details of the effects of this cataclysm and this big flood. But you are obviously, which is why I was originally interested in speaking with you, because you're talking about Atlantis as well, and you have your own theory about what Atlantis was and where it was, not least. And of course, you have studied the area in the Caucasus a lot, Azerbaijan you mentioned, and you're talking about the Caspian Sea now and the Black Sea. As far as I understand your theories, the water, the flood it kind of lasted perhaps longer in that area, southern Russia, the Caucasus area around Black Sea and Caspian Sea, because there was a land bridge at the Bosporus at that time. Now there's, of course, water flowing from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, but it didn't at that time, and that's why it stayed longer in that area. Am I correct?
Yeah, but that is actually a much, much bigger story.
Is it? Okay, sorry to bring it up.
No. If I could just backtrack a bit, talking about the planet tilting and so on, it's not just the water, of course, that's going to change. You get oceanic currents changing too. Could tie into ice ages, Younger Dryas, whatever. But the land, the lithosphere, the Earth's crust, is also going to be affected. You will get, because you've got tectonic plates all over the place, these will become destabilized. And as a result, you're going to get subduction, land's going to rise, land's going to fall, and so on. And a lot of that happened at this time too. Okay, let me talk about Atlantis. The importance of Atlantis is, I tended not to talk about it before because it's one of those woo-woo words that scientists don't like to mention. They think it's a myth. They think Plato had other reasons for telling the story and so on. But the Conference of Milos gave something like 24 points of fact that had to be agreed with and complied with for any place to become Atlantis, to become a candidate for Atlantis. I would add a few more on to that. I would talk about the Oceanus River flowing, the deep flowing Oceanus. That's exactly what happened with the flood. I've been talking about the Black Sea exiting into the Mediterranean, the Aegean sediments and so on. And you've got water coming down from the Arctic at this time. Because of the relative differences in sea level, I strongly suspect the water level was flowing through Europe at that time. That's why you've got the lobsters, larvae, and so on. But what happened, if you've got, I think I'd like to point out that I've been talking about the strand lines for over 20 years. I was invited to Moscow to talk about them too, to talk about the mud volcanoes. Now, it's pretty obvious, everyone agrees that the water level was very high. But I think you then come into the problem of, well, what could have made the water level go high? And people don't understand that, so they tend to ignore it. But I didn't ignore it. I mean, to me, it's a fact. Facts are evidence, and you've got to follow them through to the end. And basically, that's what I've been doing. So what you've had during the Ice Age is something that was overlooked, I believe was overlooked, or an assumption was made. An assumption was made that the onshore ice sheets, the Fennoscandian ice sheet, for instance, served as a barrier to any water. Now, mostly the quaternary scientists have been talking about glacial water, but what they haven't really talked about is the rivers flowing from the Himalayas, the big Russian rivers, the Irtysh, the Ob, Yenisei, and so on. These continued to flow all during the Ice Age. Might have been a bit less, might have been a bit more. If you look at the volumes today, including the Volga, you're looking over 2,000 cubic meters of water coming from these rivers. It's got to go somewhere. So as a result, the water level in the West Siberian plain rose up and overflowed the spillway, Turgay spillway, into the Aral Sea, and the Yuzboy spillway into the Caspian Sea, and over into the Black Sea. In fact, in one of my papers, I've shown you rock art that shows perhaps the oldest ever map, because it shows you the Caspian Sea, long axis this way, and water going off to the left. That's it going off through the Manich corridors into the Sea of Azov and down into the Black Sea and out through the Sea of Marmara. The point of all of that is that for 2.5 million years of the ice ages, you would have this scenario set up whereby the rivers would flow all the way through Europe. Professor Victor Baker called it the world's longest river, 8,000 kilometers long. The Nile is 6.6 thousand or so. So an assumption has been made that fresh water has been flowing all this time out into the Aegean Sea. And the evidence shows that's not the case. Now, so what could have happened? That body of water is like the Caspian. It's called an endorheic basin. Water flows into the basin but doesn't flow out. It's evaporation that causes the balance. And that's what we have in the Caspian Sea today. So you've got this massive freshwater lake. And if you go back in time to Encyclopedia Britannica, there's a chap called Thomas Bolt in Encyclopedia Britannica talk about this huge lake created by the water that's coming down from Siberia. And They gave it a name. They called it the Asiatic Mediterranean. That was actually larger than the Mediterranean. But that's, if you look at Google Earth, you can see it's larger. But that's what you've really got. You've got this massive lake. Now, if you go back into the Paleolithic information that archaeologists give you, you've got a number of important sites. You've got Kostenki, Sungir, Dokje, Vostonica, and so on. These are all on rivers. Certainly the first two are on rivers, on the River Don flowing into the Black Sea. Now the age, you've got the remains of humans that have been buried there. There's two teenagers that I really like. They've been buried head to head. Okay, that only makes sense if they were buried under a canoe. So the interpretation I've got there is that these people were using the water to get around this big lake, all the way across into Asia. And it makes sense because you had mammoths at the time, you had bison, you had large animals. And if you had a lake and the associated waterways, you could go and kill and capture animals. You could preserve them and bring them back, say, to your summer grounds. Now, I'm looking at timescales that are 30 to 40,000 years old. So you've got these people, they're human beings, they are modern people, the same as we are, didn't have the same technology. They had Stone Age technology, Neolithic technology, but that's what they were basically doing. Now, to correlate that information with genetics, you will find that the geneticists talk about the Eurasian basal gene pool. Now, what's that all about? Well, you've got a basic gene pool from Eurasia from this time period. And it's only after the beginning of the Neolithic and people moving around and so on that the gene pools diverged. So somehow or other, you've had this basic gene pool, and that makes a lot of sense in the context of a waterway, a huge lake. It also makes sense in the context of astronomy. One of the things that Fred Hoyle said of the Egyptians, I can't find the reference, but I recollect that he said that the Egyptians must have had a maritime ancestry for them to be so familiar with the heavens, the stars. And what I'm suggesting here is this Asiatic Mediterranean, and that period in time, coming all the way down, say, to the Younger Dryas, that's when these people, it was a maritime community.
So you mean because of the need to navigate when you're on the sea or on a lake?
Yeah, out of sight of land, you need to know directions.
Right.
And the astronomical knowledge they gleaned in that time is would have been involved. That actually, there's so many things I could talk about here. If you look at the
yeah, well, the evidence. Talk about the evidence that what many people refer to as Atlantis, what Plato referred to as Atlantis, was actually in this region.
Okay,
I think you're talking about mainly the west of the Caspian Sea, where there's high mountains, the Caucasus mountains. And
if you look at the Caucasus mountain range, okay, you raise the water level to 150 meters or 126 meters, as it was for the length of time. Now, the raised terraces that I've looked at, and I've radiocarbon dated in Azerbaijan and also Bulgaria, tell me that the sea level, the water level, freshwater level, was at that height, 126 meters, for the dates I've got go back to the mid 30,000 years ago. That lake was at least in existence from about 30,000 years ago down to about 17,000 years ago. That's the end of the LGM. So you've got this lake. Now, if you look at the map look at any of my diagrams, you will see that you raise the water level, the Caucasus almost, it jumps out at you almost as being an island, but it's not an island. This is where I was quite interested in Jack Kelly's story and George Sarentitis, because they got it. George got it spot on.
You can put link to that episode in the
right. George talks a few things. He talks about the Pelagos. Plato and the ancient Greeks knew about the ocean. They talk about the ocean that's around the known world. They also talk about the Gulfs. Mediterranean is a Gulf. The Persian Gulf is a Gulf. The Red Sea is a Gulf. And the Caspian Sea is a Gulf. That's how the whales came in to the Caspian Sea. He mentioned, I was really pleased when he said that the Atlantis was never an island. It was a Nisos. In other words, it was an isthmus, just like the Peloponnese Nisos, big long peninsula you've got in
peninsula Greece. And an isthmus connected to that peninsula going to the mainland. Yeah.
Yeah. So what you've got with you've got in south of the Caucasus Mountains, you've got the Kura River Valley, and then you've got the Rioni River, the old Phasis, and they came. Strabo talks about doing the journey in 4 days by ox cart from one to the other. So that gives you an idea of the water level at the time and how much the Caucasus looks like an island. Now, obviously, the water came in and stayed for a long time. It eventually subsided, but you couldn't get by. You could no longer go from the Black Sea into the Caspian Sea. So the sea level went down. So Flinders Petrie looked into the origins of the earliest Egyptians. And Petrie concluded that the earliest, maybe not all of the Egyptians, I know that to be a fact actually, they had an ancestry in the Caucasus. You couldn't work out how they could have got down there. His peers thought he was a bit crazy, eccentric on this point. And later, because Petrie was associated with eugenics and so on, race theory, and it became a kind of taboo subject. But there is genetic evidence to show that the earliest settlements in the Nile Valley, the Badarians and the Akkadians, they were associated with northeast Africa. They've got a close association there. You also have sub-Saharan people coming in too, but that came after the African humid period. So there's a hodgepodge of different people there. But in the context of what I'm talking about, the flood came at that time. The Caspian sea level was about minus 90 meters. And that was due to the drying up of the land, so to speak. And the reason for that, I suspect, is that that's known as the Mangaschlack regression. So there was no water. The Caspian Sea gets its water today 90% or so from the Volga, and other rivers contribute to that. But with the Mangaschlack regression, what I think has happened there is that the ice sheet that was the barrier to discharge to the Arctic was breached, disappeared. And as a result, the Asiatic Mediterranean dropped down in height. And because the rivers in Russia thought he could go back into the Arctic again, there was no water coming into the Caspian Sea. The Volga at that time, because of the ice sheet and isostatic depression, the watershed for the Volga was up north of Moscow. So with that being depressed too, there would be even less water coming in, and that's what I think caused the Mangaslak regression. So that was the starting point for the big flood. When the big flood came, the water levels rose up again, and anyone who was alive at the time had a few choices. You either go and live in high places if you survived the flood, or you migrate away to a place of safety. And what I suspect has happened is that a lot of migration has taken place, and there's rock art evidence for this, comparing ancient Egypt, granted it's about 5,000 years ago, and Azerbaijan. So you've got so many similarities between ancient Egypt and Azerbaijan that there had to be connections. In fact, we know there were connections. So what you've got then is ancient Egyptians, possibly 10,000 years ago, migrating away from the flooded landscape to a place of safety. And the place of safety at that time would have been the Mediterranean, and it also would have been the Nile Valley. Now, if you remember my talking about the Mediterranean sea level going up, at that time there was a waterway down through where Suez today into the Red Sea. And you also had the, the Nile Valley itself. Now, at that point in time, the Mediterranean was on the coastline of Cairo. That's where the Mediterranean was. And that's where I think the Giza monument, the Sphinx, it was created as a monument. It was created as a maritime monument to represent the zero latitude. You're going to have to take this in trust, but you can look at, unless you want to talk for another half hour or so. I mentioned earlier on in my talk about large anthropomorphic images. There's several of them in Azerbaijan that relate to ancient Egypt. Now, one of the ones that I've been talking about for a long time now is a mountain called Besh Barmak. This is like a big anthropomorphic mountain with a head with lots of horns on it. Go back to what I've said about the Caucasus being the island or the isthmus of Atlantis. Curiosity here is that the Caucasus mountain range is not horizontal with the equator. It's at the same orientation, 23.5 degrees, as the planet. So that the winter solstice, there's a monument there called the Maiden Tower that looks onto that, and there's another one further into the Caucasus that looks to the sunset at on the summer solstice. That's an aside. That's a bit more complicated. We'll not go there just now. But the point about this is that if you look at the location of Baku, that's very close to where Besh Barmak is, and that would be the equivalent, roughly, of the center of this big Asiatic Mediterranean. So it's an ideal place to have your original line of longitude. And I believe I've got evidence to support, coming from Fessenden, that Besh Barmak was actually the ancient maritime point of longitude. Even the Babylonians talk about their the point at which they fixed the zenith is in this same area. So there's a lot of things converging on this. But basically, if the maritime people migrated away, given up on the Caucasus forever, they would have to establish a new 0 point of longitude. And that, I believe, was the original Sphinx. Not the Sphinx with the spherosedrus, but the original Sphinx.
Looking like that mountain that you mentioned.
Yeah. But they had a problem because, remember, the planet is still tilting. And as a result, the sea level was going down, and the Nile Delta was coming up. So you've now got 100 miles difference between the Caspian Sea, the Mediterranean, and Cairo. So it was effectively no use to them anymore as a maritime landmark. So what happened then? Here's a question for you. Whereabouts was the lighthouse of Pharos built?
The Pharos, like Alexandria, wasn't it?
Correct. Well, just slightly off Alexandria.
Yeah.
That was built. It's a guess, a suspicion that was built as the new 0 point of longitude. And if you look at where the Egyptians and the early Greeks, they more or less transferred the zero longitude at Giza. They went north to Alexandria and built the lighthouse. And that can't be a coincidence. Why would they build it there? So looking at it from a scientific point of view, you can prove a lot of the stuff I've been talking about. What I've been trying to do was to get scientists to go to Azerbaijan to do a sediment core at one of the mud volcanoes. And what you'll get there is a succession, all the wave washing on the mud volcanoes will have washed down, and all the little quartz particles have been filled up like a capacitor. And one of the techniques we've got is optically stimulated luminescence. So you can tell when that quartz particle last saw sunlight. It has a decay function just like radiocarbon dating. So what I wanted to do was to drill down into the sediments and date. I'd like to know when the flood actually happened and how long it lasted. Now we have the technology to do that. I kept on being pleasantly surprised by the things I was looking into, and I am getting corroborating evidence. And one of the things I looked at was to do with Göbekli Tepe, which I'm sure you know about.
Yes, southern Turkey, close to the border with Syria today.
Right. It started out at the Younger Dryas 12,000 years ago, and it was abandoned and filled in 10,000 years ago. These are fixed dates. But the date at 10, and when, I think they're changing their story now, but archaeologists have long said that for ritualistic reasons or whatever, the temple structures is like a recess the temple is in. That was all filled in. Now, I don't believe that for 1 minute, simply because if you look at the filling in process, you will see that it's filled in layers. Now, each of the
enclosures.
That's the word I was looking for. Each of the enclosures have been filled in the same way. You can see a layering effect. Now, that's a signature of a physical effect. If you were going to ritualistically fill in an enclosure, you would get a heterogenic mixture of stones and rubble and soil inside each enclosure.
Interesting.
You don't have that.
I didn't know that it was in layers. No, nobody said that. I haven't heard anybody talk about that.
I can give you 2 papers on it. Not only that, you've actually got gypsum and you've got carbonate. Where the stones, some of the stones have been analysed, and you can see the bottom of the stones, you've got gypsum and some carbonate. That's a signature of seawater. So I then began to think, well, maybe Göbekli Tepe was impacted by this big flood. And that's an easy one to test, because I think Göbekli Tepe is closed now for archaeological investigations, but you don't need to go there because you've got wadis. You've got large wadi delta structures on the plain of Haran. You can do the same thing with the mud volcano, drill that to find out when the water was active there. But there's an even better one that I found shortly after that, and that came from Greece. The University of Patras had done a study, and I came across this bit of information showing that in Lake Phineas, or Phonia, it's had a few names, you can actually see a high water mark. It's a high water mark at 767 meters above sea level. Okay, so you get high water mark up here, and then you get the soil all kind of washed away, and that's why you've got such a dominant watermark, because anything above it, the soil holds on. The soil is there, so vegetation can grow, but down below it, there's less vegetation. Now, the University of Patras did a core study on the lake bed, and they showed a major discontinuity around about 10,000 years ago. Now, two things here. How high is Göbekli Tepe? The answer to that is about 760 meters above sea level. How high is the waterline in Lake Phineas? It's about the same. And both of them, Göbekli Tepe was destroyed 10,000 years ago, and you got this major thing happening 10,000 years ago in Lake Phineas. And remember, I talked about Israel, the Levant, that had a mega tsunami at the same time. So my inclination here is to say that Göbekli Tepe was destroyed by the Great Flood.
You are focusing mainly on the geological evidence, I suppose, and then the geophysical evidence, but there's also cultural evidence and cultural connections. You've been talking about that too, but I mean, I think it's also very interesting you have to look at all things, and you have to look at the ancient texts and ancient traditions and all of that. And so if these people were, let's say that Egyptians, the dynastic Egyptians that we are referring to, were actually originally coming from this area that was flooded. Everything, it was, the flood affected the whole globe, but this area around, the Caucasus Mountains, that's where they originated from. So they moved south. Then the question arises, so because the dynastic Egyptians seem to have been very, very advanced. They had a very advanced technology. They built these. If they built these pyramids, for instance, it's there's no precedence. I mean, there's nothing comparable anywhere on the globe, actually. So, I mean, many people suspect that they were perhaps built much, much earlier by some other civilization that was wiped out, and then the dynastic Egyptians found it and took over it and all that. But you are suggesting that they were actually coming from north, from the Caucasus, and they built these monuments as some kind of memory of the old land, which you interpret as what Plato referred to as Atlantis, and his relative Solon heard this from Egyptian priests telling him this, and this is what they were actually referring to, according to you, as far as I understand the whole thing. But were they as advanced when they lived in this Caucasus area? I mean, are we going to find remnants of similarly advanced structures, megalithic structures, fantastic temples and stuff like that in that area if we dig up? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I'm not talking about dynastic Egyptians. You're looking at thousands of years difference. I think what's happened is that the earliest people, let's call them flood survivors, that's a neutral term, moved across to the Mediterranean, and they settled in North Africa. You got the Berbers there, the symbolism, the upright arms. If you look at the national flag of the Berbers, it correlates directly with pottery, rock art, and so on, to do with even Azerbaijan. So that there's a connectivity in all of that. What I think has happened is that there has perhaps been two waves of people leaving the Caucasus region. The first probably went out after the flood. So that's maybe 9,000 years ago. And then the second correlates to the rock art that I've got. I mentioned the boats coming down through the Mediterranean, going into the Red Sea, and then they cut inland. There's two wadis, Wadi Baramia, and another one beginning with W. Forget. Anyway, they moved in. So you've got the correlation between the rock art connecting all of that together. So these people came in and they were pre-dynastic. Okay. Now, if you look at some of the Flinders Petrie's work, you will see that there was a technological influx roughly at that time. So you've got that. Not only that, you've got people moving into ancient Sumer at that time, the Indus Valley at that time. All of these lasted for some time. Certainly the Indus Valley was destroyed during the early Bronze Age. So there's an awful lot of things happening. I think it can follow a line of argument to suggest certain things, but ultimately, I don't want to talk about pyramids. I mean, you've got pyramids all over the world. You've even got them in China. So how did they get there? I don't want to go down that road because it's difficult. You get into opinions. I like to focus on facts. And the biggest fact that I think I can try and encourage people to do is to confirm that there was a flood just after 10,000 years ago, and that it was such a high flood. And there's geological evidence I've talked about, there's physical, there's biological. There's a lot of evidence that can be looked into and correlated to this time frame to show that something extraordinary happened there. Yes. I can't say it was the planet tilting. I strongly suspect it was the planet tilting and slowly recovering, and there's good evidence for that, whether it's Senmut, whether it's the solstice shadow sticks, or a vast amount of information from Ptolemy. I would love to know another explanation.
But it's, I mean, everybody who has a theory, an elaborate theory around these things is of course, I mean, we should appreciate everybody, every independent researcher, and also, I mean, tenured researchers who are looking into this, because we don't know exactly what happened, but there are some, I mean, I think it's fascinating, and I think I'm very grateful that you're doing this work, because we need all kinds of inputs to understand what actually took place. But just to clarify around Atlantis, so I'm going to wrap up here, but you do think that when Plato talks about Atlantis in his two dialogues and referring to what the Egyptians talked about, referring to Atlantis, they were talking about this land as being the area around the Caucasus. That's correct, right?
That's right. I mean, you've got to remember too, the Egyptians are talking about not just the Atlanteans, they're also talking about the ancient Athenians, and they all died out too. So that's somehow right. These groups of people all died out, and it makes sense. I could talk to you about the soils of Greece and how there's several anomalies there, which makes sense in the context of a large flood coming out of the Black Sea region. So anyone who was there at the time would have been killed, basically, because the land just probably isn't high enough, or their civilization was so destroyed by it. There's an interesting, I think I've got it in one of my papers, I talk about Troy. And I was at a conference that was given by Professor Yilmaz, Turkish, and he knows all about Troy and Troy Bay. And he's got a monograph of Troy Bay showing you there's some excellent diagrams there showing you how Troy Bay was filled in over a period of about 6,000 years with sediments and silt from the Karamandaris, or the Scamander River. Even today, it's very rich in silt, and it keeps the alluvial plain very fertile. So the problem I had when I saw that diagram was I asked myself the question, if that river has been discharging sediments for such a long time, forever, basically, what happened to the early Holocene sediments? They were all, there was no sediments there, or there was very little sediments, but they've all been covered over by the Holocene sediments. And if you look at the juxtaposition, if you look at the the geography of the Dardanelles, the water coming out of the Black Sea would have impinged onto Troy Bay and would have eroded all of the water away. So I think once the water level went down, decreased, and the siltation started to happen again, Troy Bay was filled up. So in a sense, if it wasn't for the flood, the story of Troy would never have been told.
Yes, I understand.
Does that make sense?
It's fascinating. It does make sense, yeah. So we've covered a lot of ground. I mean, almost literally. I mean, geographically, we've covered a lot of ground, and I will make sure to put in maps on the video so people can follow your trains of thought and explanations as to what happened many thousands of years ago. So Ronnie, what's your next project? Where are you going next with this fascinating research?
I've got a few irons in the fire. One of them is to do with ancient megaliths. I've been looking at, have you heard of a cranog before?
Oh, I think I ran into that term when I read one of your papers there. I can't remember what it is. Something in Scotland, is it? Ireland?
Yeah, I started to look at them in Loch Nell in Scotland, and I worked out that the cranogs, the standing stones, the burial mounds, stone circles are all in alignment. So you can see where the sun rises and sun sets. So that alerted me to the fact that these people, these ancient people, were very conscious of following the sun through the year. The sun goes up and down the horizon between winter and summer solstice. So I then asked myself the question, well, how can I show that this is real? And then I then came across cranogs which have got causeways on them. Okay. Now, by the law of averages, I've looked at some like 170 different cranogs.
But they're dwellings, right? Or what are they? Dwellings?
No, they're not. They don't. They seem to be ritual sites.
Okay.
Some pottery had been found. No one really knows what they are, but the ones I've been looking at are full of boulders. Now you can't walk about on them; you'll break your ankle. So, but they serve the function, and they're several hundred. Some of them are several hundred yards from the beach. But the ones I was interested in was they serve a function too because they tie into solar alignments. Now, the cranogs that I'm talking about with the causeway to the nearest point of land, you would think by the law of averages, you would get all of them, wherever the island was relative to the land. You get enough of them, you just see there's no relationship. They're just
no consistency in the orientation.
That's not what you find. When I looked at them, I've yet to write this paper up, but you find that there are clusters of them, east-west, northwest, southeast, northwest, northeast, southwest. So in other words, the cranogs are aligned to the winter solstice, sunrise, sunset, due east, or sometimes the cross quarter days too. And there's enough of them to show that there must be there's meaning behind this. These have not just been built carelessly. They serve the function. The problem I've got is that there's about a 10 degree, if you take the midpoint, 5 degrees either way, you don't always have, you can use Google Earth to work out where the sunrise and sunset is, and you don't quite always get the midpoint. You get a wee bit either side. Now that's quite interesting, because you've got to ask the question, well, how could that have come about? These people were quite, they were obviously good at monitoring the heavens, so why would they get it wrong? And again, I think the answer is to do with planet tilting or wobbling.
Yeah.
I'm very concerned about what I've been looking at, because I'm absolutely convinced there has been a flood. And it's scientifically simple to prove that there was a flood. And it may be the case that there was actually two floods. There's one to do with the early Bronze Age. That can come out of scientific study. My concern is, if it is related to the sun, coronal mass ejection, and so on, who's to say when the next one's going to come? If you've got the 10,000 pointer, 6,000 years later, you've got the early Bronze Age, and 6,000 years later, heck, you've got today.
Yes, so, that's what Robert Schoch talks about as well.
Does he?
Yes, well, he says that it's a matter of time when the next one is coming. So,
well, I wouldn't look. I mean, that's a horrible thought. It's a horrifying thought to think.
Yeah, but it might be 1,000 years, which is actually nothing in geological terms. But in 1,000 years, much can happen. Maybe we can. Humanity can then migrate to other planets. I don't know.
You're not going to get. The problem is, you will, if you have another planetary upset. Most of us are going to die. We all live close to the sea level. So I think what the challenge today should be is for our civilization, if you like to call it that, to make provision for the next flood. We can't do anything about it.
So, Ronnie Gallagher, where can people go now if they want to find out more about your research, your work?
I put a fair amount of stuff onto my page in academia.edu, and there's one or two things in ResearchGate. I tend to use academia.eu, and I've got a lot more to put onto it. But
you don't have a website per se, or?
No, I'm not technically accomplished enough. The problem with the website is that it commits you.
Yes,
to
I know.
Lot of things.
I know.
And I've been too busy doing it.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I'm just lazy.
Well, we'll put the links to the Academia site in the description box, of course. And so thank you so much for being a guest on Mind the Shift, and good luck with your continued exploration.
Okay, thanks for having me. I hope something that's said kind of makes sense to people, and they might wish to look into it. But the bottom line for me is that from a scientific perspective, much of this can be investigated. A lot of it is speculative, but I don't really believe in coincidences, not when they all point in the same direction. So there was a big flood, and it had a lot of consequences.
Thank you so much, Ronnie, and good luck now.